Welcome to another deep dive. Okay, today we're heading somewhere really unique. We're talking about Eswatini, the landlocked nation between South Africa and Mozambique. You probably knew it as Swaziland until recently. Just imagine a country in the 21st century still with an absolute monarch. But it's also dealing with all the complexities of, the modern world. It's this fascinating mix of ancient tradition and very current challenges. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a range of sources, everything from historical accounts right up to recent socioeconomic reports.
It's an amazing place to study, really, and our mission today, I think, is to help you unpack this complex picture. We want to explore Eswatini's history, its really vibrant culture, the challenges it faces now, and where it hopes to go in the future. What jumps out from the material, again and again, is this idea of profound contradictions. It's why people often say it's not one, but many Swazilands. We're going to try and get into those layers for you.
Okay, so with a place like this, so much history, where do we even start? Well, our sources take us way back. Stone Age, apparently the earliest signs of human life there go back maybe 100,000 BC, hunter-gatherers, belief systems tied to nature,
Yeah.
that sort of thing. It's a very, very ancient stage, even if, the specific details are pretty thin that far back.
That's right. And for a long time after that, the land that became Ongwane country, well, it wasn't heavily settled by Iron Age farmers until around 8400. And it's really important to remember a lot of the Swazi understanding of their early history comes from oral tradition. The sources we looked at are careful to point out that these stories, while incredibly rich, also have obscurities, gaps, and contradictions, which just means, there are missing pieces, different versions of events, things that don't quite line up. Historians have to piece it all together.
Right. So given that ancient past and relying on oral history, how did the actual Swazi nation, the one we sort of recognize, come together?
Well, the oral traditions, they suggest this process of ethnogenesis. That's basically the forming of a distinct ethnic group and state. And this seems to have taken place over maybe 300 years or so. It really centered around the ruling clan, the Eswatini clan, who gradually brought different groups under their umbrella.
And what did that look like, on the ground? Any specific migrations or conflict that really shaped things early on?
Oh, absolutely. The founding father, Indavan, led parts of the Eswatini clan to settle initially in the southern highlands. Mountains and water were clearly important, but it wasn't exactly peaceful. This period also saw powerful groups emerge, like the Inwandwe army. The sources describe them as known for ferocity, speed, and successional complaints. And the last bit is interesting, suggests internal power struggles often fueled their aggression. And this forced lots of other clans to flee, including Indavan's own son-in-law. People lost land, cattle. The accounts describe real terror. And even though the Inwandwe eventually moved south, their impact, their sort of disruptive impact on how the Swazi nation first formed was huge.
Okay, let's fast forward quite a bit then into the colonial era. Swaziland becomes a British protectorate in 1903, right? Confirmed in 1906. But reading through the sources, it sounds like the British view of this was, well, pretty cynical.
Oh, very much so. The documents really highlight that the British basically saw Swaziland as just a buffer state. A useful piece of land to help them consolidate their own power across southern Africa. It wasn't really about protecting the Swazi people so much as British strategic interests.
So what did that protectorate status actually mean for the Swazi people? Was there any real protection involved?
Not really, unfortunately. Despite the name, the Swazi lost a lot. We see evidence of an almost immediate Swazi land grab. By 1945, 11% of their land was under white occupation. Yes, some modern things appeared, like a railway reached Letekulu in 1895, but the overall feeling from the sources is that colonialism actively blocked the chances to develop in key areas. And we also read that the British specifically went after and took control of this all-important mineral-rich area north of the Great White River, apparently held Southern Africa's largest mineral reserves. They got it after defeating the king's son. So, yeah, less protection, more extraction and control.
Right. Well, it's hardly surprising that kind of thing led to resentment. How did people push back against this?
There were different kinds of resistance. The sources mentioned things like petty protests and activist groups slowly started forming. There were even attempts, desperate ones, to mobilize an army, even though that was illegal under British rule. Shows how frustrated people were. Of course, that was met with brutal repression. The British also tried manipulating leaders like King Mbanzeni, setting up new administrative systems, but it didn't really lead to the cooperation they wanted. The king often found himself opposed by coalitions of Swazi and white interests, and taxes often just weren't delivered.
So this wasn't just simmering quietly. By the turn of the century, these tensions were really starting to boil over.
Exactly. Foreign invasion, illegal settlement, it all fueled this deep resentment, often expressed through patriotic local chiefs standing up. This whole period ended up creating what one source calls an uneasy hybrid form of administration, especially after the Second Boer War. And critically, this laid the foundation for really significant, vigorous festering resentments, things that would definitely come out into the open later on. You can see the seeds being planted.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. The real push for independence for Swaziland, for Eswatini, that really gathered steam after World War II, didn't it?
It really did. In 1944, you see the formation of the Swaziland African National Congress, the SAMC, and they specifically appealed directly to the British Crown, asking for an administration that would actually uplift local Africans, not just manage them.
And how did things happening in South Africa next door play into this?
Oh, hugely. The rise of South Africa's United Party in 1948, with its explicitly anti-color policies that set off alarm bells in Swaziland. It definitely intensified calls for political rights, though an early attempt, a motion in 1949, didn't pass. Now, the SANC itself struggled for mass support in the towns, but the late 60s, early 70s, that became a key window. You had failed talks between Britain and South Africa, growing anti-apartheid feeling in Britain. This led the Liberal Labour Party government to start hinting at more independence for Swaziland. Interestingly, though, the sources say the very mention of independence was met with fright by some within Swaziland itself, and anxiety among other colonies about, newly liberated black governments. But despite those fears, this was the moment, the critical moment, when the independence movement just burgeoned forth almost overnight.
And the central figure through so much of this was King Sobhuza II, right? His reign was just remarkably long.
It really was. King Sobhuza II, he reigned from 1921 right through to early 1982. That's longer than any other monarch in Southern African history. And his main focus, his primary concern throughout that long reign was what the sources call the restoration of Swaziland's subject status, essentially reclaiming sovereignty.
How successful was he in achieving that? And did he have worries even as independence finally arrived?
Well, by 1964, the British administration's power was down to mere residual authority. That was a big step. And after the 64 general election, Swaziland's own government became responsible for almost everything. This led to the birth of a new Swazi nation, new flag, anthem, currency, passport. It was hailed across Black Africa, a really significant moment. But yeah, even then, the aging king had worries. He was concerned about some intelligent, educated, and politically minded Swazi who he felt were looking down on traditional folklore. And maybe most significantly, he worried about the future because he hadn't formally named his successor. That caused him real concern. He even subtly warned other monarchs about stability after the Ugandan president was assassinated in 1980. Shows the weight on his mind.
Which brings us closer to the present day, the post-independence era, including the name change to Eswatini for the 50th anniversary. Now, King Mswati III, despite calls for reforms like legalizing political parties, he's consistently said the monarchy's basic policies won't change, prioritizing stability. But how has the monarchy actually dealt with the growing dissent over the years?
Well, this period saw really rapid social and economic shifts, and that naturally created discontent. For a while, petty opposition was sort of tolerated, but that changed sharply in 1973. King Mswati III declared a state of emergency, banned all political activity, political writings, everything. Then, fast forward to the late 1980s, a major uprising was being planned by a united opposition front. But Mswati moved first with a harsh crackdown. Hundreds arrested, many jailed without trial, and tragically, several key activists were killed or just disappeared.
That sounds incredibly severe. Did that actually bring the stability the monarchy wanted?
Ironically, no. The sources suggest it did not increase the stability of the monarchy. The underlying discontent was just too strong. You even see evidence of this in December 1989. 2 members of the royal family were shot and killed by opposition sympathizers. And those sympathizers were reportedly getting considerable assistance from the South African government at the time. Shows the complexity, the internal and external pressures.
It's really striking how, amidst all this unique political structure took shape. You mentioned that 1983 edict. It upheld the 73 Constitution, talked about democratic governance, but then explicitly called political parties a potential source of instability. No. So Parliament was brought back with more powers, but the king kept his supremacy relatively unfettered by anyone else. And they specifically said this is not a return to Western democracy. How has that actually worked out?
It's been a very, very tense balancing act, as you can probably guess. Through the 80s, anyone supporting democratic reform faced detention, exile. The government really cracked down. Protests grew, the king banned them, used listings of alleged seditionists, basically blacklists, to harass and detain activists, journalists, anyone seems pro-democracy. There were some slightly softer moves leading up to the 1988 elections. Eswatini rejoined the Commonwealth. But media restrictions actually got tighter. The sources state the regime in that form collapsed only in 1994, which was a period of major upheaval. And that was followed by more unrest between 95 and 98 student sit-ins, major strikes, incessant assaults on the police. The government kept trying to silence opposition with coercive methods, like raiding leaders' homes in the early morning. It's just this ongoing tension, this push and pull.
Let's pivot a bit now to the economy. What really drives Eswatini's economy? What's its heartbeat?
Well, it relies heavily on a few key industries, which is kind of dominant but also dualistic, meaning big plantations alongside smaller farms. The big ones are sugarcane growing, agriculture more broadly, and increasingly tourism. Since the 1960s, you've seen a lot of modernization in agriculture, especially sugar, moving from really labor-heavy traditional ways to large-scale plantation farming.
Sugarcane seems like a real pillar. What makes it so important there?
It absolutely is the main industry. It's focused in the lowlands near South Africa, and it's pretty efficient, producing about 160 kilos of sugar annually. The big mills like Swaziland, Maloom, Big Bend, they're mostly cooperative owned, with the government holding minority stakes. And then you have a multinational NCP exporting a huge chunk, 75%, mainly to the UK and US markets. It's often held up as a success story, actually, because it managed to involve local farmers alongside that big foreign industrial capital. It's an interesting development model.
Does that success in sugar offer a model for other parts of the economy, or are there unique things about sugar that make it hard to copy?
That's a really good point. Sugar definitely benefits from specific things.
Right.
The climate there, those established international markets. Other sectors might not have those same built-in advantages or attract the same level of foreign investment, you know. So it shows a possible path, but maybe not an easy one to just replicate everywhere. And speaking of other sectors, tourism, that's obviously huge globally, and Eswatini sees it as key for development.
Yeah, I can see why. The descriptions are great. Attractive, easygoing country. Some of Southern Africa's loveliest wilderness reserves.
Yeah.
But still, the numbers are quite low compared to South Africa next door, like 750,000 tourists a year versus almost 10 million. What's the gap there, and what's the potential?
Yeah, that gap is striking. Infrastructure is improving, but tourism growth has real risks that, according to the sources, the industry isn't quite ready for. Things like vandalism, pollution, and congestion, potentially damaging the very parks and attractions people come to see. But there's definitely opportunity. Developing those untouched national parks for more tourism, but maybe balancing that. There's also this idea of geotourism. The sources define it as responsible travel to natural areas that conserves the environment and improves the well-being of local people. That approach could help preserve geological sites, generate conservation funds, and attract a specific type of tourist looking for less-known places. It's about finding that balance.
That makes a lot of sense. So how do these economic changes, especially the tourism push, interact with, the big force of globalization in Eswatini?
Globalization. Yeah, the material really paints it as a double-edged sword for Eswatini. On one side, sure, it opens doors for economic growth, social development, brings in new tech, access to markets. But at the same time, it penetrates really deep into local culture, local business. It can, as one source puts it, transform the hustle and bustle of small towns into sterile places erased of local color. Big international businesses often benefit most, while the market for smaller local businesses gets squeezed out. So you get this uneven growth, lots of small businesses potentially facing extinction. And local culture, traditional rituals, ways of expression, they risk becoming just artifacts or cultural trophies for tourists rather than living parts of society. There's this subtle but real pressure, with research noting unthinking conformity among the young as globalization's influence grows.
That's quite a stark warning. Let's turn to the social structure, the culture itself. It sounds incredibly rich. I understand it has Sotho origins. You see it in the colorful clothes, traditions like the stick fighting, Lilanga. What else really defines the social fabric?
Well, one of the most fascinating things is the way gender, power, and inheritance work. It's quite unique. For passing down goods, it's traditionally matrilineal inheritance goes through the mother's line to her sister's children. But political leadership is patrilineal, so important positions usually go to the king's sons. However, there's also a very powerful female role, the Unkosatana. She holds clan headmanship, which means real political influence, and she's nominated by the king. Clan headmanship gives her authority over clan affairs, disputes, representation. It's significant power.
So a woman can hold real political sway in that specific role, even if the top leadership is male.
Exactly. Now, the Constitution does grant equal rights on paper, but generally, women are often seen as secondary in society, mostly handling domestic work. The sources note that a woman who becomes very prominent in public life can be held suspect. And even a queen traditionally gets only a limited education, but she holds indirect power, maybe through prophetic priests or through her Itshali, her right-hand woman, a key advisor. So you have this odd mix. It's maintained a public status for women that's perhaps lacking in most other sub-Saharan African societies, yet ironically, there's also a noticeable lack of representation of Swazi women at posts requiring education. It's really complex.
Moving now to one of the most difficult challenges Eswatini has faced, especially since the early 2000s, the HIV/AIDS crisis. What's the situation there?
It's been devastating. Despite a lot of international help with treatment, Eswatini has had incredibly high rates. In 2018, the estimate was 200,000 people infected out of a population of just over 1 million. That gave it the world's highest HIV prevalence among adults. To put numbers on it, a 2016 survey found, alarmingly, 41% of adults aged 40-64 were HIV positive, and 35% of those aged 20-39. And there are still huge needs. As of late 2017, around 30,000 HIV-positive people weren't getting treatment, and 15,000 infected children needed therapy.
Those figures are just staggering. Is there any good news, any signs of progress in fighting this?
Yes, thankfully there are some encouraging signs. The rate of new infections, the incidence, seems to have dropped significantly, from over 9% a year back in the late 80s down to nearly 2% in 2016. And in 2015, 85% of adults who needed treatment were started on it, and nearly 80% of those on treatment achieved viral suppression. That's huge progress, getting close to those global 90-90-90 targets, 90% knowing status, 90% on treatment, 90% virally suppressed. So the challenge remains immense, absolutely, but the progress being made is undeniable and really important.
Okay. Beyond health, Eswatini obviously faces other deep structural challenges in trying to achieve stability and a better life for its people. What's the bigger socioeconomic picture like?
Well, the sources paint a pretty consistent picture. You've got very high unemployment, over 70% mentioned. That's combined with widespread poverty and really stark income inequality. This makes it incredibly hard to create a basic social safety net, and it feeds into high crime rates and, understandably, calls for political change. Eswatini was designated a low-income country back in 2001. Its economy is fragile, it's landlocked, heavily dependent on South Africa, and suffers from regular droughts. After some growth, the country hit an unprecedented budget deficit recently, forcing really tough cuts, government spending, civil servant salaries, investment projects, all slashed.
That sounds like it would cause major public anger.
It absolutely did. It led to great dissatisfaction, big public demonstrations, and the poverty became very visible. Kids unable to afford even school uniforms or transport. It's not just relative poverty, people feeling poorer than others. It's absolute poverty, leading to sickness, starvation, and social disintegration, according to the analysis. It's a very serious situation for many.
So, in that incredibly tough environment, what about the future? Particularly for Eswatini's young people. They're the future, right?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? Back in 2004, kids under 14 were a huge chunk of the population, but their involvement in the formal economy, in social work, it was limited, to say the least. And tragically, youth issues were often linked with high crime rates, high parental negligence, and ultimately suicide, a really vulnerable demographic. But there are efforts. Projects focused on economically empowering young people, tackling violence, helping reintegrate offenders. There was even an initiative led by the Queen Mother herself, trying to equip young people with skills for safe socializing, productive thinking. So there's definitely a focus on investing in that next generation, creating new ways to make a living. But these projects are sensitive. They need real buy-in from everyone involved to actually work.
Okay, finally then, let's just touch on Eswatini's position internationally. How does this small kingdom fit into the regional and global picture?
Well, it got formal international recognition back in 1968 when it joined the UN, and it does have a voice in Southern African affairs, being part of SADC, SACU, those regional bodies. But the reality, as the sources consistently point out, is that it remains uncomfortably dependent on and dominated by South Africa. The wider international community knows this is a tricky situation, and different countries have called for a more balanced arrangement. Despite its size, Eswatini's location, its geographical centrality, and the fact it maintains ties with both East and West, it suggests its potential role in regional politics could be undoubtedly considerable. But whether it can actually play a more independent, meaningful role, well, the sources say that's debatable.
So wrapping this all up, Eswatini, we've covered so much ground-deep history, a really vibrant culture, but also these stark modern challenges. It's such a complex place.
It truly is, and the sources capture that perfectly, saying it's not one but many Swazilands with many contradictions held in balance. You see signs of colonial development, Western influence, right alongside what gets described as primitive bush life. It's that mix. And then, uniquely, you have this spectacle of the cohabitation of absolute monarchy and parliamentary democracy. It's navigating really perilous ground between those two.
This is beautiful rural country, mountains, valleys, amazing views, trying to build tourism, deal with environmental issues, but at the same time, grappling with just crushing socioeconomic problems, unemployment, poverty, and fighting the world's highest HIV rate.
Which really leads to the final big question, I think. In a world that's increasingly transparent, interconnected, can a nation that's historically kept this sort of silence, invisibility, and fallibility around its core leadership, can it truly balance the demands of that absolute monarchy with the clear aspirations for modern governance, for social well-being, for engaging with the world, without losing that rich, complex, unique identity?
The profound question indeed. We'll leave you with that thought to ponder as you reflect on the unique journey of Eswatini, truly a kingdom unlike any other.